Okay. Well, Kyle, good having you
Of
on
course.
here today. We're here at the home of John Sevier, the
That's right.
first governor of Tennessee and one of the Overmountain
Absolutely. So we're here at Marble Springs State Historic Site, of course. We're a Tennessee Historical Commission site here in Knoxville in South Knox County. Like you said, home of Governor John Sevier while he was governor.
men.
So the site dates back to about 1796, and of course until his death in 1815. So we have 36 acres here of historic property belonging to John,
Hmm.
of course, where we have hiking trails, we're an arboretum,
Hmm.
lots of small accolades, of course, and of course we have the cabin that he lived in, and
Hmm.
it's his only remaining home.
Hmm.
But we here operate as a museum. We have programs and tours and everything and the like. But I know, Jim, you're visiting here today. We're going to talk about the Battle of Kings Mountain and John Sevier.
Yes, yes. Um, it started in the Watauga area, or the people were from there. What were they like back then, and
Sure.
what were they facing?
Sure. So you have these, not just the Watauga, but the settlements of this area,
Correct.
right? So we're talking over the Appalachian
Hmm.
Mountains. You have settlers like John Sevier,
Hmm.
who finds his way out there from Virginia, who are carving their own path. Some of it was some animosity
Hmm.
toward the British government. Remember, we still very much had a king. We're
Hmm.
still very much, being controlled by the British government. And many of them are leaving and crossing these boundaries and almost illegally settling.
Hmm.
Some of them are actually leasing land from native tribes, including the Cherokee and the Choctaw, and aren't actually supposed to be there. We have some evidence that some people, even as something as simple as sheep, where they were moving there to escape the taxes
Hmm.
being done on wool, right? And this is something that should be a shock to, I think, anyone learning about the American Revolution, that taxes was a very main point of contention
Hmm.
with the people of the colonies. So the Wataugans, as well as other settlements in the area, they are on the fringe of of society. We always joke with the kids, it's a far frontier, it's the Wild West, it's North Carolina,
Yeah.
right? But it really is. North Carolina is this first frontier. It's the Wild West of what we think, right? Very much of this land is still owned by native tribes there and indigenous
Hmm.
tribes there, and they are sometimes making deals and treaties, but other times encroaching on this territory. So there's a lot of hostilities at this
Hmm.
time. The people of Wataugan have to be self-sufficient, and not only self-sufficient to take care of the winter food, but also defending themselves, right?
Hmm.
Um, and as hostilities increase, of course, getting closer to the American Revolution, these Wataugans, these other people of the settlements, are finding themselves increasingly against the wall,
Hmm.
right? They're stuck between British oppression and Native American, violence, and they are just trying to survive at some point,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So they're thriving at later on, but really this is a tough life for people carving out their own world in this new world,
Hmm.
right? Is finding these settlements. So you're to answer your question, long-winded answers to
No,
that.
that's a great answer. Yeah.
They are self-determined. Many of them are escaping the regime. Many of them are just looking for something new,
Hmm.
right? I don't know where John falls upon this.
Hmm.
John moves about in his early 20s with 7 kids
Hmm.
to the Watauga settlements. Now, remember, John was a little unlike a lot of the other Wataugans. He had gone to school. He had, was an educated man, and quickly found himself, um, you know, in a leadership role.
Hmm.
He becomes a magistrate of the area. He's being well respected. He's a young man, still
Hmm.
very much at this time, but he's also found that knack of that military leadership.
Hmm.
And I always tell people that's because that was a common occurrence. Being attacked and rushing back to Fort Watauga or the
Hmm.
other forts of the area was a common occurrence.
Hmm.
John's first wife, legend has it, says that she died while escaping one of these attacks.
Hmm.
When she dies of exhaustion. Of course, the famous story of John meeting Bonnie Kate, right? It's in
Hmm.
1776. Is one of these fights, right? One of these sieges against the fort.
Hmm.
All right, he pulls her up over the wall, right? It's
Hmm.
how valiant of John Sevier. But this was a true, this wasn't a every now and then story.
Hmm.
These conflicts of these peoples who were both trying to live their lives really dominated the sentiment of not just the Wataugans but John Sevier.
Mhm.
And if we touch upon the struggles of natives, indigenous people, as well as John Sevier, this really, I think, sets the tone for how John treats them and then how he works with them as well later on. So it was a very violent time period. It was a lot of uncertainty,
Mhm.
and quite frankly, death was all around you,
Mhm.
whether it was by disease or just trying to survive. These were hardy people who made the conscious decision to go
Mhm.
out there, or maybe not. Maybe they were avoiding someone. We're not 100% sure, but it's hard to draw up everyone kind of in a similar vein. But if
Mhm.
you looked at these people, we know what their experiences
Mhm.
were like, right?
How did John treat the Native American people?
So John is very kind of gray. It depends on when it is. He clearly has an animosity against them,
Mhm.
but not all tribes are the same.
Mhm.
So you see in many of his letters, he is trying, especially a little bit later, not after the Wataugan, he's very trying to keep peace.
Mhm.
War is expensive.
Mhm.
War is disastrous for
Mhm.
communities on the frontier. Um, and so you do see some letters where he's acting as a mediator between tribes.
Mhm.
He's sergeants are asking him to pull off encroaching white settlers off
Mhm.
their land, right? These treaties have to be kept,
Mhm.
otherwise,
Mhm.
hostilities begin again. John, matter of fact, the last mission of his life, he leaves here from Marble Springs, and he goes down to Alabama, well,
Mhm.
what would be Alabama, and he's sent as a commissioner to draw up territorial lines between the natives there.
Mhm.
He actually meets with the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Creek, and he is actually mediating between many of them, and as well as the United States,
Mhm.
to draw up lines.
Mhm.
Uh, I've always said that he's diplomatic when he's diplomatic, and he's violent when he's
Mhm.
violent. Because John does employ many brutal tactics that some of his contemporaries were calling out, including George
Mhm.
Washington, of him destroying Cherokee villages
Mhm.
entirely, right?
Mhm.
But again, at the same time, he was a well-respected warrior
Mhm.
among the natives as
Mhm.
well. So you'll see the Cherokee, talk to him in through letters in ways that they clearly were respected.
Mhm.
And they were talking about other tribes and their sentiments and their sentiments. So John, just like many people even today, are gray, right?
Mhm.
You have to in history read kind of the subtext,
Mhm.
right, of how they're talking. Like,
Mhm.
and I personally see it in John's letters. He very clearly has an animosity for the Creek. He
Mhm.
does not respect the Creek at all.
Mhm.
Where the Cherokee, at the end of the day, he wants them to become a great people. He mentions this. He's trying to convince them, even though there's a little bit of a lacing of this kind of, you know, uh, manifest destiny about it, right? In
Mhm.
some of his private letters to his son, he basically mentions that the land is likely going to belong to the United States. It's likely going to be
Mhm.
Tennesseans, but he wants to do it by the law,
Mhm.
right? He just feels that in the future that the Cherokee will slowly start to erode their lands,
Mhm.
right? Even in one letter, he mentions to some Cherokee about if you're not going to use the land to use it for agriculture, we need it more than you, and
Mhm.
but you should utilize this land and build your great villages, and he actually talks to them about establishing trade routes,
Mhm.
and he says it would be, and I quote, prosperous for the white and the red man, right, to
Mhm.
keep the trade open. So again, I think John was not grown up, but had faced this violence throughout his whole life.
Mhm.
And talk to any veteran of wars today, right, and they tell you that they're usually anti-war,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Famously, there's books that you can read, all quiet on the Western Front, right? These are all veterans who have seen these things firsthand,
Mhm.
right? And I think John was very similar, where by the time he's governor, he's a middle-aged man. He's trying to avoid these conflicts as
Mhm.
best as he can, right? He just knows that war kills multiple people,
Mhm.
innocent people, and it's destabilizing, especially for an infant state like Tennessee in
Mhm.
1796, where sometimes it's teetering on a balance,
Mhm.
and a big war is going to break out, can really disrupt the safety and the security of a state.
Mhm.
So to answer your question, yeah, that's something we look at very closely here at Marble Springs, and including with our partners
Mhm.
and some of the Cherokee tribes around here that we talk to them about. But John is a has mired his name, especially with the treatment of the natives.
Mm-hmm.
However, while he's the governor, there does seem to be some type of relative peace. The Trail of Tears hasn't happened yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? The removal of indigenous peoples out west hasn't happened yet. But you can start to see the foundations of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? John does famously support some things while he's a congressman to keep sovereignty for these nations,
Mm-hmm.
right? And to enact harsh penalties. Not to ramble, but in one letter to the Cherokee, there were two counterfeiters that had gone into the Cherokee land, and instead of requiring them to be returned to the United States or Tennessee to face justice, he says, punish them as you see fit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're in sovereign land. They're
Mm-hmm.
in your property. They're
Mm-hmm.
not in ours. We're not even going to extradite them.
Mm-hmm.
Punish them, and whatever that would be. I don't know the punishment of a counterfeiter in native land, but he clearly is showing in that letter, again, that subtext, he's saying, we're not going to come in there and get them.
Mm-hmm.
They're up to you,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever you decide is what we will go with. So John's saying he's not going to be upset even if they're killed.
Yeah.
He's saying they're in your land, they're in your laws. Do what you see
They're
fit.
probably better off going back to the
Who knows?
Patriots,
And who knows? And there were people that did escape into native land,
Mm-hmm.
and some slaves,
Yeah.
too. So many
Mm-hmm.
tribes, some tribes, practiced in the slave trade, and some didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So it's dependent. Matter of fact, one of John's own son-in-laws is actually part of the tribe.
Mm-hmm.
At least from what we can tell,
Mm-hmm.
he was taken in as a young child,
Mm-hmm.
and he was raised by a tribe and knew how to um, uh, speak one of the tribal languages. I'm pretty sure it's Cherokee, but but he was a white man, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he
Mm-hmm.
was not indigenous by
Mm-hmm.
birth at all. So each tribe was different. I always try to tell people
Yes.
that sometimes I think we do a disservice to indigenous peoples by blocking them,
Mm-hmm.
right? They all acted or they all did something
Mm-hmm.
similar, but in reality they didn't. And some tribes broke off from one
Mm-hmm.
another in disagreement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Famously, the Chickamauga, break off from the Cherokee because they do not honor they don't recognize, I should say, the treaties being done with the United States and the Cherokee, and they believe that they're almost being sold out.
Mm-hmm.
So and I think that's why I kind of bring that back to John. Is I think John kind of took it to case by case basis.
Mm-hmm.
I think he saw some as, for lack of better terms, what he said, savages,
Mm-hmm.
and then in some ways, he's trying to work with peace with them.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's reflected in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
his letters, as well as some of his actions as
Mm-hmm.
well.
How did the Watauga area
Mhm.
get dragged into the war?
That's a good question. So you have the British employing what's called the Carolina campaign or the Southern campaign, right? The idea was if you split the colonies in two, it was much easier to sustain a war. There were loyalists all throughout the colonies, anywhere. And of course, there was patriots everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? However, most loyalists were actually from southern colonies. You would find a higher percentage, and their idea was if we split the country in two, we can raise forces from American forces, loyalist forces. It's cheaper, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to bring soldiers all the way over from England.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of time. It's a lot of money. They need soldiers they can raise now.
Mm-hmm.
So General Cornwallis puts Colonel Tarleton and Major Patrick Ferguson, and he's going to come up a lot in this story, to move through the Carolina backcountry to secure it, right? They also knew, and kind of going back to that, the further west you got, the more patriot sentiment there was. Remember, these are people who are out there not because they love the English crown, because they're avoiding it, right? And so after the capture of Charleston, they begin moving west, and they're going to go through the Carolina backcountry to secure it. They're getting pestered by skirmishes, right? They're getting pestered by men like Isaac Shelby, who's going to be the governor of Kentucky, the first governor of Kentucky. And as they begin moving westward, they meet resistance. Ferguson was sent out there because apparently he was pretty charismatic. He was this young Scottish officer who had invented, a new type of rifle. He had a sharpshooter corps, and was actually really good at whipping up loyalist forces, right? He's going through the countryside, convincing people to remain to the crown. So as he's heading out there, he's encountering these forces, right? Of course, as they begin meeting resistance, a warning is sent. Some people say it's a letter, some people say it's over word of mouth, but it essentially says, and I'll try to quote it as best as I can remember it, right? It's, if you do not lay down your arms, I will march my armies over these mountains, hang your leaders, burn your villages, and you will be met with sword and flame, right? Again, I'm paraphrasing that
That's
a little
fine.
bit. I need to memorize that word for word, but it's essentially, submit or doom, right? So Isaac Shelby actually is one of these men that actually goes to the Watauga settlements and talks to John Sevier, talks to the leaders of these settlements, and basically urges Watauga to meet Ferguson in the field, right? If this threat is true, he's going to burn our villages, hang our leaders. I mean, that's essentially just scorched earth, right? So at this time, they're being convinced that the only way to repel the British forces is not to fight them at our homestead, it's to fight him elsewhere, right? So that's where of course, the mustering of Sycamore Shoals comes in, right? You have men like Isaac Shelby, you have men like John Sevier. They start raising militia from their counties or from their settlements, and they're going to meet together and rally a force, of course, called the Overmountain Men, right? So that's how Watauga gets drawn in. Is these Isaac Shelby and other Patriot leaders are kind of fighting against the British at the time, and this warning. This really was that big kind of match point moment, right, where it kind of, it's the spark, right? It's this warning that as they move to capture this countryside, the British are quite frankly getting just upset. They're getting pissed about it, and they send out that warning to desist. Lay down your arms, or we're going to come over there and we'll show you what's what. And
This
they met
this
a
is
foe.
this is purely opinion, but what do you think would have happened if he had never said that? If
He had
Ferguson
never
had never
said
said
that.
it?
So that's a good question. And of course, we'll never know the answer for that. But I feel like it might have happened anyway. Maybe not the way, of course, like the mustering and things like that. I think likely that the British forces would have seen it as almost an uncontrollable area. Remember, at the time, you also had the Wataugans and the other settlements defending against the natives. So why are they going to open up two fronts? But I think what really was going to drag them in was the fact that a lot of these attacks that were being done were actually being encouraged by the British. Right? They were encouraging Cherokee to attack the forts, right? And they, with whether it was monetarily wise or alliance wise, right? So, matter of fact, Dragon Canoe, was famous for doing this. Was attacking all these settlements in 1776, by working with the natives. John actually mentions that in a letter later on during the War of 1812. Actually, John actually proposes that if the British are to invade the United States, that we would actually start basically offering a bounty to the Cherokee first, right? So here's the thing: they knew that. John clearly even brings it up. He says, "Well, if we do it, we can offer a bounty for every British scalp," is what he says in the letter, right? And they're actually thinking about doing this if British invasion occurs. And of course, this is in the War of 1812, much later. So, I think that the growing hostilities of the natives in the area, I think, were already, combined with a lot of these people who don't want to be part of the British crown. I feel like it would have probably gotten to the point where if they got too close, it would have happened. Of course, maybe the mustering, maybe obviously Kings Mountain exactly would have happened. But I think it was to the point where these people out in the countryside were ready to fight. And as the British got closer and closer, that threat became more imminent, right? It's different when they're in Boston and New York and New England fighting George Washington. It's different when they're on your front doorstep.
Yeah, when they're right over the mountain.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you said there's loyalists and patriots
Yeah.
in Watauga. Could the patriots meet out in the open?
Not quite sure of that. From what we know, a lot of these patriots, they sent their leaders, right? And it makes sense. Like John was one of these, right? There was someone that they trusted to speak on behalf, right? When these forces are being raised, obviously, I imagine some people aren't joining or
Mhm.
even going off to join
Mhm.
Ferguson and his loyalist forces.
Mhm.
I always remind people that the Battle of Kings Mountain wasn't these British redcoats.
Mhm.
In some of the officers' accounts of it in British, there was about 115 actual corps.
Mhm.
Right, these are sharpshooters. There's he even mentions there's some dragoons. These are British
Mhm.
redcoats. The rest of them are loyalist
Loyalist.
militias.
Mhm.
So there were clearly people in the area ready and willing to fight for the British
Mhm.
crown, right? And you see numbers all over the place with the American Revolution, but generally it's accepted that about a third of the population was patriot, a third was loyalist, and a third was
Yeah.
just trying to kind of get by.
Mhm.
They kind of didn't care,
Mhm.
or they were kind of spectators. Again, that's generally accepted.
Mhm.
Obviously, these sentiments change. Later in the war, you actually see more Southern regiments starting to
Mhm.
join. Right, this is all of a sudden this is a fight we could win. Right,
Mhm.
people are getting swayed to join patriot causes.
Mhm.
So it's always hard to put numbers down, but there certainly were people of both. But personally, I think in the Western frontier, I think most people were leaning either patriot or not caring
Mhm.
versus loyalists.
Mhm.
Because as Ferguson gets west and west, again, he's starting to encounter more, you know, skirmishes, not
Mhm.
less of them, right?
Mhm.
So that clearly means as he moves westward, it's getting harder and harder for
Mhm.
him.
Okay, so they muster the troops
Yeah.
at Sycamore Shoals.
Mhm.
What happens after that?
Well, they needed to find where Ferguson was, right?
How-
Remember, the mustering is done in late September of 1780, and people forget about this all the time. But this even goes even until the Civil War. But you can't fight in winter.
Mhm.
You have to feed troops. You have
Mhm.
to get them supplies. You have to survive, right?
Mhm.
I mean, we know George Washington is literally freezing his butt off,
Mhm.
right? And that's because they had to. But
Mhm.
most people retired back to their homes, right? It's the harvest season. It's
Mhm.
September. It's October. The situation was dire.
Mhm.
They had to find Ferguson, and they had to find him
Mhm.
fast. So the journey, takes about 2 weeks, but they lead down, about 330 miles to the border of North and South Carolina, where they find him.
Mhm.
Right. So, and their thing was they had to get back, not just because of the winter coming, not
Mhm.
because of that, but remember, they're leaving their homes abandoned.
Mhm.
They are. You mean Bonnie Kate is with his kids by herself.
Mhm.
Watauga is essentially undefended. If
Mhm.
there's another dragging canoe coming
Mhm.
up, they can't be at two places at once.
Mhm.
So they have to get in, get out. And this is reflected in exactly the absolute speed and velocity that the Overmountain Men are taking. They're marching 330 miles in rough country to find him, and sure enough, they do.
Mhm.
A couple of spies
Mhm.
tell where Ferguson is. Of
Mhm.
course, Ferguson is kind of keep an eye on this force that's moving toward him. Remember, it's about 1,000 men on
Mhm.
each side. Numbers kind of vary. You'll see 1,400, 900. But once they get to Kings Mountain, they discover where is, of course, on top of Kings Mountain, I should say.
Mhm.
And then, of course, the battle will
Mhm.
take place on October 7th, 1780.
Mhm. And you said it's a tough journey. It's not flat.
Right. Well,
I'm from
absolutely.
here, and it's mountainous.
Right. Absolutely.
North Carolina, East Tennessee.
These places are not being settled very very frequently.
Mhm.
They're bouncing. You can even see in some letters by James Sevier. They're basically bouncing from station to station. Right.
Mhm.
There are outposts in the area. There are patriot friendly taverns. Matter of fact,
Mhm.
they even visit one cabin where it says that they have dinner and they're talking about the loyalist forces in the area.
Mhm.
So they're not. It's not uninhabited, but you almost can never take a straight line. If you
No.
actually look at the
Mhm.
journey, it kind of whips up and it goes
Mhm.
down and around and it comes back to Kings Mountain,
Mhm.
right? So it was a tough journey.
Mhm.
John, they're described as leading their own cattle.
Mhm.
They're trying to get provisions from North Carolina, which is being denied, and
Mhm.
they're basically herding their own cattle. John actually gets a loan, and basically he loans out some money to purchase provisions that he'll get paid back later. And lots of these men are doing this,
Mhm.
right? So it was almost. I mean, I hate to say the word, but slaps together.
Mhm.
It was we have to get in, we have to get out, we can't sustain ourselves,
Mhm.
and we have no other support other than
Mhm.
us. Now, of course, this mustering is from people all over.
Mhm.
It's from different regiments East Tennessee and different settlements into Southern Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, right? So Sevier is said to bring about 220 men himself. Cite Isaac pretty much the same. William Campbell has the biggest force. He's coming from, I believe, Southwest Virginia, and he has about 400 men. So you can see they're all gathering together under almost their leadership. So John included, to face Ferguson.
Okay, so they end up at Kings Mountain.
Of course. Yes.
What happens then? What's
Sure.
the scenario?
So it's very dramatic, right? So as they approach Kings Mountain, two of Sevier's men defect. They wake up, they're missing, and their equipment's missing. Now they're not quite sure what's happening, but there is a sentiment apparently among the men that they are going to tell Ferguson about their position. So the Overmountain Men take their fastest horses and their best riders, it's usually about 900 men, and they push forward to advance against Kings Mountain. Now, on Ferguson's side, he does know due to some of his spies, he does know about the encroaching force. They actually move to Kings Mountain, which is a more defensible area, and they essentially they ask Ferguson to send a force to relieve them. They're running low on supplies. However, I'm sorry, Ferguson asked Cornwallis to relieve them. Sorry. They're running low on supplies, and during this time, they barricade themselves on top of this mountain. They're running low. They send out actually a foraging force, about 100 men, 150 men, to actually go and forage. And what they didn't expect was the rapidness of the Overmountain Men's attack. This is something that actually some British officers even note. That while they knew that the force was in the area, it wasn't a complete surprise. They were surprised that they got up there that fast. They draw up the lines at the base of the mountain, and you can see maps of this. Some of it's debated on where, but you'll see that they're following their leaders. There's an Isaac line, an Isaac Shelby. There's a Sevier line. There's the Campbell line. There's the McDowell line. Right? You can see all these lines forming. And while William Campbell was the main leader, he couldn't be everywhere at once. And because of the mountain and its shape, legend says, of course, we don't know this for a fact, but one of the officer says that you have to fight like your own commander, right? And make your own duties. It's something I'm paraphrasing there, but that's kind of the way it was. It wasn't like kind of what we think of a battle with your lieutenants and your sergeants, and all this. It was going to be a full-on force at the same time. Rushing up a mountain. You even see some reports that lines are bleeding into each other. All of a sudden, they're part of someone else's line and they're fighting, right? So you can see accounts from veterans like that. So on October 7th in the early afternoon, the Patriots hit Ferguson forces at the top. The way it's described, it's a fast and ferocious battle. The battle actually only takes about an hour to get completed. You see as low as 47 minutes. You see as high as an hour and 5 minutes. But we know it was quick. Of course, legend has it, but it is described by an officer later. But they wanted to get in and be ferocious. William Campbell tells his men, to shout like hell and fight like the devils, right? A British officer writes about it later. He describes the Overmountain Men as these tall, sinewy, he says they're devils from the infernal region, right? So, right, their skin and bones are rags hanging. He talks about their matted hair, specifically, and their rags hanging off of them, but that they got hit hard. And that's what really took them by surprise. British accounts of the battle kind of draw up the same thing, that they were unprepared for that exact day. So as these Americans hit from all sides, essentially what's happening is the difference in weaponry that they're using. They were hoping, the Patriots were actually hoping to get supplies, including cannon and muskets, but instead they were using their rifles, which came to their benefit. The rifles, of course, having a much longer range in these woods, were able to hit these loyalist forces hard, and the muskets did not have the range, nor could they get a hold on them. They tried a few charges. The British tried to charge. That was their main strategy: get right up in your face. But the Overmountain Men just disappeared back into the woods, and then all of a sudden they were getting hit from the sides. It was super chaotic. Apparently, Ferguson was known. He was kind of flashy. He had a checkered shirt. It's usually described as. He was blowing his silver whistle. However, Ferguson gets struck. Now, every every man in Tennessee said that it was their grandpappy that shot Ferguson. Trust me, I've met many people. We don't know who it was, but Ferguson. There's a painting of this, of course. Is he falls off his horse.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few stories we don't know really which one's true. One
Mm-hmm.
of them, he's still alive. They go to take him prisoner. They shoot him on the ground. He turns
Mm-hmm.
around. He has a pistol. Right? It's very dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But we know that Ferguson is dispatched. Right? He dies during the battle, and his second in command, they're losing ground.
Mm-hmm.
They throw up the white flag and they begin to surrender. From what we know is we don't know if this was a sentiment or if it was a mistake. The British begin to surrender. However, the fighting doesn't stop. The Patriots are gunning down loyalist forces
Mm-hmm.
as they're beginning to surrender. Now, some people say it's chaotic. It's the heat of battle, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're all around the mountain. The guys in the back can't hear anything. There's screaming. There's gunshots that no one really knew, especially when the commander is gone, right? Some people say that it was retribution,
Mm-hmm.
right? Colonel Tarleton, famously, I believe it was, I can't remember the battle name right off the top of my head. I'm blanking on that. On the Battle of Camden,
Mm-hmm.
the American forces surrender, send
Mm-hmm.
out the white flag, and Tarleton gives an attack order,
Mm-hmm.
even on surrendering. So there's this kind of notion, and there's some accounts that say they say give them the Tarleton quarter or
Mm-hmm.
give it to the boys, like that. So there was this retribution. Now we know, and I've seen reports that this actually stops. As they're getting pushed up the mountain, Shelby and Sevier make it to the top and find surrendering British.
Mm-hmm.
It's written about in accounts from people that are there that I'm not sure if Shelby or Sevier said it,
Mm-hmm.
but essentially it's I never remember men that surrender while the rifle's still in their hand and
Mm-hmm.
they basically throw them, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is an account that James, or one of the Sevier sons, I'm pretty sure it was James, but it could have been Joshua, was actually starting to execute British
Mm-hmm.
officers. He had heard that a Sevier had been killed during the
Mm-hmm.
battle. And excuse my language, but he says, "I'll kill every damn one of you, son of
Mm-hmm.
a bitches, for killing my
Mm-hmm.
father." Of course, John's not dead.
Mm-hmm.
He rides up and sees his son, and I'm sure that was a very big relief moment. But a Sevier was
Was
wounded.
killed. Mm-hmm.
Of course, that was being Captain Robert Sevier.
Mm-hmm.
James writes about this that while he was reloading, he got struck with a bullet.
Mm-hmm.
His brother, Robert's brother, Valentine, helps move him off to a spring, and
Mm-hmm.
James takes him with so he can drink some water and relieve
Mm-hmm.
himself. After the battle, actually, a British surgeon comes up and begins to help Robert and tells him, "I have other intending duties, but if you do not let me take out that bullet, you will surely
Mm-hmm.
perish." It basically hit his liver.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, he apparently dismisses that.
Mm-hmm.
Robert actually goes with James to go home, and about, I believe it was 15 days later, dies of his wounds,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he dies within an hour. Apparently, he's doing fine.
Mm-hmm.
He eats, and then in 1 hour, he gets
He gets.
unwell and he
Mm-hmm.
dies.
Mm-hmm.
So, John himself, loses a brother,
Mm-hmm.
right, in this battle. And that's incredibly sad because the casualty rate is so overwhelmingly in Patriot victory,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I remember correctly, you have about 300 casualties on the British side, including wounded and dead, and you have about 600 prisoners,
Mm-hmm.
right? And on the American side, you have about 90 casualties. I'm pretty sure it's like 20 something deaths.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of them, of course, being wounded. So
Mm-hmm.
so one of these hits home. It's Robert Sevier, John's brother.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, so the battle was fast, and of course, after the battle, the prisoners had taken. There is some reports about the prisoners being treated really unwell
Mm-hmm.
by the forces. There was one thing talking about how prisoners if they wanted to drink, they were charging them $40 to take a drink from the canteen. They wouldn't let them drink from the streams. They did actually officially try some of the officers for
Mm-hmm.
war crimes. They hanged 9.
Mm-hmm.
But the treatment wasn't good of the
Yeah.
British and the loyalists then
Mm-hmm.
too. And remember, this wasn't just British redcoats. This was loyalists.
Mm-hmm.
These were people that lived in your community
Mm-hmm.
and decided to fight for
Mm-hmm.
the British. It almost kind of reminds me of the Civil War. It would be like the betrayal in a way,
Mm-hmm.
to have someone to join a confederacy when you were a union, or the other way,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, a lot, especially here in East Tennessee, many East Tennesseans fought for the union. So
Yeah.
imagine like kind of the betrayal that you
Yeah.
would feel. and of course it was being taken out
Mm-hmm.
on a lot of these men. So of course this is a decisive victory for the American Revolution. The
Mm-hmm.
Carolina campaign essentially is put to a halt. They leave the Carolina backcountry and they go back to Charleston. It
Mm-hmm.
basically stops this whole plan of dividing the country in half because they can't hold it.
Mm-hmm.
They can't hold it against men like Isaac Shelby and John Sevier, who are going to decimate, the British forces out in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is one of the most important battles of the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I have to say that it feels like, because I talk about John Sevier, but if you look at accounts and you look at George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, um, they talk about the King's Mountain in
Mm-hmm.
such high regard. The battle, the battlefield trust said it's one of the most important victories of
Mm-hmm.
the entire American Revolution. In 1780, this was the victory that the United States needed.
They had to have it.
We
Yeah.
had to have it. It wasn't just not even just a tactical
Mm-hmm.
victory, but it was a morale victory,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have these Southerners, these backwoods men, these, for lack of a better term, hillbillies,
Mm-hmm.
defeating a British force entirely,
Mm-hmm.
wiping them off the map,
Mm-hmm.
right? You start to see more Southern regiments join in. Like I mentioned, you have
Mm-hmm.
this kind of we can win this moment,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of these people who are either loyalists change, or you have a lot of these people who are neutral that start to lean into the Patriot favor,
Mm-hmm.
right? And of course, Cornwallis goes on to surrender at
Mm-hmm.
Yorktown, and we win the battle. So,
Mm-hmm.
of course, we'll never truly know, but one of the turning points of this war of our independence is Kings Mountain. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, John is a big part of this. John's
Yes.
name comes up over and over,
Mm-hmm.
and this is really what puts John on the map
On the
for
map.
his
Yeah.
future exploits, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why we're sitting here today, and of course, maybe John would have maybe climbed up some frontier ladder, right? But Kings Mountain made him a household name,
Mm-hmm.
right? He was a hero of Kings Mountain, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's Tennessee's first hero, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it really is what gives him credence, because before that, John's kind of just an everybody. He's just
Mm-hmm.
not a nobody, but just like anyone
Well,
else.
you're out here in the boonies, in the
Right.
wilderness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And while he is an educated man, of course, he doesn't come from any big family.
Mm-hmm.
He's not from, from wealth. He doesn't have this long military career that his
Mm-hmm.
father was, whatever. No, he is a man in the wilderness that by circumstances
Mm-hmm.
becomes a leader. It literally forges him
Mm-hmm.
to become John Sevier,
Mm-hmm.
the man we know today.
Yes. Now, going back to the two people they
Yeah.
suspected of spies, is there any record of them being spies or just?
So it is said that John, after the battle, finds these two men, and he clears them. He
Mm-hmm.
doesn't execute them. Right,
Mm-hmm.
being a traitor, that was a hanging.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So John mentions it a few times, and there are some accounts, some firsthand accounts of these men who are found after the battle that basically, by the grace of Sevier,
Mm-hmm.
kind of lets him go. Now, again, we always try to dispel rumors here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because how convenient. Wow, he has such a good heart,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it does seem to be true. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, from what we know these men basically face judgment from
Mm-hmm.
Sevier, who basically clears them of any
Mm-hmm.
charges. So
Mm-hmm.
nothing is ever brought. It is said that they obviously have disdain
Mm-hmm.
in their community. I don't think it was helpful that they did that, but
No.
they don't get executed, and
Mm-hmm.
so we know that, or at least it's said that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no records of him killing any
Killing them.
traitors or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that, but there are some accounts of him basically
Mm-hmm.
not falling at Sevier's feet, but basically being faced with judgment,
Yes. Yes.
right? And John clears them of
Yeah.
any wrongdoing.
Going back to home, Watauga, and all that,
Mhm.
it was fairly dangerous,
Mhm.
from what I understand. Can you talk about that?
Just living in Watauga?
Well, I
Or-
understand that there's skirmishes coming back, and then you have all those prisoners you're going back to.
True.
And,
Well, the prisoners are actually moving the other way. They're actually not coming back.
okay.
So William Campbell kind of takes over. He's kind of the leader, and he kind of leads them elsewhere.
Mm.
But John and many of the Overmountain Men make their way back. Now, this is not before engaging in a campaign against some Cherokee. There's a campaign, a pretty violent one, where John goes and they're burning Cherokee villages on their way back. They were afraid of another uprising or something along the lines of that. But it didn't stop. The violence never stopped at Kings Mountain. Matter of fact, the violence would continue for quite a long time. But the Overmountain Men disperse. John is able to make it back with many of his men, right? Who then go back to their home.
Mm-hmm.
Right, winter was right around the corner. The American Revolution is not won yet.
No.
But the foundation of that victory is really being set.
Mm-hmm.
A British officer, and this is what I really like to point out. He says this very specifically. He says basically that after the defeat at Kings Mountain, the British could never gain a foothold or a victory again.
Mm-hmm.
He almost describes it as like, I say a snowball, but you
Mm-hmm.
can kind of see that's what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one defeat led to another,
Mm-hmm.
and it just kind of cascaded all the way down
Mm-hmm.
until Yorktown,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's so even the British officers, even British military, are saying that Kings Mountain really is where it ended
Mm-hmm.
for them,
Mm-hmm.
right? For the Wataugans, they defeated a force that was threatening them personally.
Yes.
So they almost took it personally, right?
Yeah, they did.
Because
yeah.
they didn't go off. The Wataugans aren't going off to Boston and fighting
No.
along George Washington. No, they disperse and go back home. Remember, these are militiamen,
Mm-hmm.
right? These are men that are not getting paid. These are not in the
Mm-hmm.
Continental Army. They are simply militia from the local region that are
Protecting their
protecting
own.
their
Yeah.
own land
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
their own settlements. That's
Okay.
correct.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you would like to add here?
Well, of course, I love it when people visit Marble
Yeah.
Springs State Historic Site. Of course, Kings Mountain is just one point of John's journey here. The area, of course, is full of history here in Tennessee. After this, you have the state of Franklin, right, that comes out, right? This land is now being ceded by North Carolina, and this idea of self-governance is now a reality, right? And it's an experiment. They make a state. John is the governor of the state of Franklin, right? And kind of similar things. You kind of see reflections of the American Revolution in a lot of this early Tennessean history, right? They're trying to figure out, how does a state run? Are we sovereign? What are we doing? What about the treaties with the natives? Which ones are being recognized, right? The treaty by state of Franklin being recognized by North Carolina, which is being recognized by federal government. We don't know. And so this early history of the state, we're very much the frontier.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We are the American experiment where state of Franklin fails to become the 14th state, right? So, and John and many of these men who fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain, are involved with these early settlement, right? At the end of the day, that's what John is. He's a frontier politician. He's famously for that, right? He's a man of the people. He, again, is not from this big family. He lives in this house, in this cabin, not this one you see on film, but he lives in a cabin that's very this very, very, very vernacular, is what we would say, right? He's a very popular man. He's governor for 12 years. He's a congressman. He's a state senator. He's working as a commissioner with the president of the United States to draw up territory lines between, native groups as well as the United States and Alabama. So John Kings Mountain made men, right? This is what I like to say. And it was one of those moments, and for those that might be watching that aren't from the area, I never heard about the Battle of Kings Mountain as a student of history, and there might have been mentions of it, but you hear about the big ones, Lexington, Concord, Saratoga, Bunker Hill. Who can forget about any of those? Of course, Yorktown, right? But here you are in the southern region. You had this southern campaign with this frontier victory that the more we read about it, the more even our founding fathers say was one of the biggest upsets.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so there's so much history in this region. Of course, East Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, the South, that is so intrinsically divided. Because whenever we think of, when I think of, I'm sure maybe most people do. When they think of American Revolution, we think of places like Boston and New York. We think of these, the Boston Tea Party. We think of these things, and while that's absolutely correct, the South is almost kind of forgotten.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have, the capturing of Savannah, the capturing of Charleston, but you don't have any other thing. But here is a Southern victory, that changes the course of the war. And I find it super interesting.
I do too. I had an ancestor there.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's one reason I like it. But Yeah, I like the fact that these nobodies
Mhm.
came out of the woods with very little training. They were good hunters, and they did have to fight Indians for
Right.
defense,
Mhm.
and they beat a better supplied army. And
Right, and they fought in a different way that they knew how.
yeah,
So I have no doubt that they were employing those tactics
hmm
against the Cherokee,
yeah,
and with the Cherokee, they're using these backwoods fighting
hmm
that while many of the loyalist forces were accustomed to, and there were rangers there
hmm
too that were fighting in the woods, you're not going to beat the guys who do it every day of their life.
no, no,
And I think that's where they caught the British almost overextended,
hmm
because the British, of course, pull back,
hmm
right? They don't keep moving forward. They pull back and they overextend themselves. And of
hmm
course, Ferguson is struck down, losing a sizable portion of their loyalist force and the
hmm
militia force, as well as this charismatic man who is supposed to
hmm
be pulling loyalist forces from the
hmm
area. It's hard to pull loyalist forces when nobody wants to do it all of a sudden,
yeah, yeah,
right? But yeah, just to add that, there's lots of history that is surrounding us. For the 250th especially, there's a lot of 250th surrounding probably your viewers, right?
oh yeah,
Whether it's in Tennessee or Georgia or
hmm
wherever that is, right? The 250th isn't just Philadelphia and Boston
no,
and New York. It's not these places. It's in your own backyards. And even here in Knoxville, we have revolutionary figures like James White and of course John
hmm
Sevier, William Blunt there over there,
hmm
signing the Constitution. But we have that that bridge to the 250 celebration.
hmm
So for those that might be in the area, we'd love to see you guys. We'd love to see everybody here, to learn about your local history, and of course how that ties into larger schemes. I always tell people it's one of those things, especially people from out of state who never have heard of John Sevier,
hmm
right? That John Sevier was just one of those men that is regionally important, but he rubbed elbows with everybody you
hmm
read in
hmm
history books, right?
yeah,
There's letters between Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and everybody that you've read of before.
and Native American,
And
the tribe leaders,
absolutely,
so he's
tribal leaders
yeah,
are,
yeah,
are throughout there. There's hanging mob that's included, dragon canoe.
hmm
These figures in history that we see, we respect,
hmm
we revere, and they
hmm
touch local history more
hmm
often than you think. So
yes,
so
yes.
small places like this, like Marble Springs, are a little bit of a treasure of just a glimpse of our nation's
It
founding.
gives you a good feeling, and being in this cabin kind of reminds you it. You can almost feel what it was like
Right,
back then.
right,
And then there's no noise around here. The beautiful trees. It's gorgeous out
right.
here. I can't imagine what it's like in the fall.
It's beautiful in the fall. It's beautiful all throughout the year.
hmm
And John lived here for a very specific reason, and I
hmm
think you're pointing it out.
Yeah,
If you
yeah.
notice, we're not in Knoxville.
No,
We're
no.
pretty far, and considering you had to take a horse and cross a river to get to it.
hmm
This was very much a home of John Sevier.
hmm
He's this very much his office space, we say,
hmm
right? So, um, now did he live out here because he's just a good old boy and he
hmm
loves the countryside? Who knows?
Yeah.
But you can see just a glimpse of John, and like you said, even in the walls themselves,
hmm
right? Even though he's not here, even though maybe we're not hearing things from his mouth or from his writing, you can look at the way he lived on his own property, and you
hmm
can kind of start to feel it,
You
right?
do.
You get a reflection of it,
You get a feeling.
right?
It's hard to say the right word. Reflection. I don't. You get a sense of it. You
Absolutely.
know.
And that sense is what museums are made to do, right?
hmm
It's made to reflect people to reflect on these things, right?
hmm
Not just to look at cool furniture or cool things,
hmm
right? And don't get me wrong, there are some cool things
hmm
out there, but it's to put you in the shoes of these people. It's to put you to think, right? I
hmm
mean, we told the whole story of Kings Mountain, and I hope at least some of your, you know, listeners put themselves there,
hmm
right? They could hear the whizzing of the bullets. They can
hmm
hear the gunshots crack and the screaming and the whistle of
hmm
Ferguson blowing on his
hmm
stallion, right? Like, putting you there is part of a historian's job, and it's to get you to think of how it felt,
hmm
not what happened.
hmm
I can tell you dates and
hmm
numbers all day long, but the idea of history is to reflect and to contemplate, and then to acknowledge as well, just
hmm
where we're from, how it was, and oftentimes I always tell people you'd be surprised of how similar they are to us today than they were back then, right?
hmm
oftentimes, sometimes the simplest answer to some of these questions we don't know is, well, what would I have done,
Mhm.
right? And it typically even comes back to that is like, well, I would have done this, and perhaps that's what happened,
Mhm.
right? So museums are important for that.
Mhm.
Museums are are made for this reflection. And so, again, I challenge your listeners
Mhm.
to visit these museums, your
Mhm.
local museums, and and not just give money or donate, but just to be there.
Yeah, yeah.
We're here for the public, and we're here for people like you, Jim,
Mhm.
where we meet with people to talk
Mhm.
and to discuss and to learn. And while I do consider myself at least somewhat knowledgeable about these topics, we're learning every day. We
Mhm.
learn, we read new letters, we contemplate new things.
Mhm.
We will never know the true 100% detailed
Mhm.
story of anything in history. But
Mhm.
what we can do is read these sources, discuss this with the people
Mhm.
of our findings, and then get people to reflect and
Mhm.
think about their own past,
Mhm.
our nation's past, and just kind of how it's affected who we are today.
Mhm. You're right. You're
Mhm.
right. In Tennessee, East Tennessee has a lot of museum-like places, Sycamore Shoals.
Absolutely.
Oh,
There's
well, that
quite a
whole
bit.
area, that whole area
There's
is,
quite a
yeah.
bit, and they can check out our sister sites too. We're part of the Tennessee Historical Commission,
Mhm.
so there's quite a few sites, including Tipton Haynes House, which
Mhm.
is very involved with severe history.
Mhm.
But you'll find them us all throughout the state, whether that's colonial or
Mhm.
later on. So
Mhm.
um, there's museums in every corner of the
Mhm.
country. I always love to point out the fact that there are more museums in the United States than there are McDonald's and Starbucks combined.
Oh, good.
So you have no shortage of museums to visit, and they can be as small as volunteer run to as big as a
Mhm.
state museum. So every museum wants your patronage,
Mhm.
and every museum has a story to tell.
Mhm.
And I hope here at Marble Springs we tell it well.
I
We,
think
we we reflect. We have people reflect, and we have some interesting things
I
going
think
on.
you do. It's very impressive. Very
I
impressive.
appreciate that.
So,
I appreciate that.
well, thanks a
Well,
lot.
of course, Jim.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for
Okay.
talking to me, and
Yeah. Thanks for being
and
on.
I'm happy to do it. So,
Okay.
all right.